In the next chapter of your life, you'll be able to persevere through any mid-career struggle you're facing while navigating the uncharted waters of your next chapter. How do I know? Because you're listening to this podcast. Get ready to shed your current identity and shift into the next chapter of your life that's narrated by the future of you. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Next Chapter podcast. Today, I want to talk to you about what you may not want to bring with you into your next chapter. So I want to cover a couple of things. One is I want to talk about, let's say, a vicious work cycle that you may not even realize that you have become habituated to, adapted to, you're doing without even realizing it. You know, when you do something for a long time, 10, 15, 20 years, you don't even know that you're doing it. I also want to talk to you about the actual definition of workaholism. I came across that the other day, and I was blown away by the guy who created the word. I think it was a psychiatrist or something, and how he defined it in the DSM, which is the diagnosis book that doctors use. And I was like, oh, that actually describes a lot of people. And then I want to talk about how you can leave behind what you don't want to bring into your next chapter. One of the reasons I'm sure that you're thinking about a new chapter, even in the first place, is so that you could increase your levels of meaning and purpose and fulfillment from what you're currently experiencing now in your life. So let's talk about that work cycle that you're on, or the kind of work ethic that you live your life on a day-to-day basis with currently. There is this sort of vicious work cycle that a lot of CEOs have. So, for example, the average CEO works 62 hours a week. That's a lot of freaking hours. The average employee works 45 hours a week. There's quite a bit of difference there. But when you think about those 62 hours, what it does not leave room for is to cultivate any sort of relationships. Now, why does that matter? Well, the problem is that we know from happiness studies that they all come down to fulfillment is always derived when you are in relationships that are outside of business. Think about it. When you're in a relationship that's outside of business and you're hanging with your friends and you're laughing and you're having a good time, that just leads to higher levels of fulfillment and happiness. It just does. You're just happier. When they do these surveys, people will self-report that that's the most important thing that makes them happy. Rarely does the guy in his deathbed say, I wish I worked more. We know it intuitively, but it isn't how we behave. So if you take this a step further and you ask yourself, well, why does the CEO work 62 hours a week in the first place? If you ask them, they're going to say something like they're doing what's required to get it all done, and they don't have much of a choice. If I want to continue being a CEO and I want to get all of this done, this is what I got to do. The author of the book that I alluded to at the beginning of the podcast, his name is Arthur Brooks, and in his Strength to Strength book, he says, I'm not buying that. I think that is bullshit. And he said, here's how I think it really goes. The CEO becomes successful because he or she has worked more hours than anybody else, and as a result, created this astronomical level of productivity. Okay, here's the problem. The rewards from that productivity gives them a fear that they're going to fall behind. So they become super productive. Then they get this fear, because I'm productive, I'm going to fall behind. So they keep grinding. And then eventually, the work that they're doing crowds out any time for relationships outside of the office and leaves only time for work or relationships inside of the office. And so this cycle repeats, and it becomes this Krebs cycle, this loop that just keeps going round and round because you're just trying to keep it moving. So here's the point. If that scenario describes you, then you may want to consider leaving that part of you in your next chapter. And let me tell you, it's going to be harder than it sounds, because this is something that you're used to. Like you're running a company, let's say, or you're an entrepreneur, you're a solopreneur. You're running these things. You have a work ethic, an ethos, a drive, a focus, a plan, and that's how you do it. Let's talk about workaholism. I came across this definition and I couldn't believe it. Workaholism, by definition, is the compulsion or need to incessantly work. So think about your day, even if you're not the CEO. When you're not working, you probably, if you're anything like me, you feel guilty that you're not working. And with the advent of smartphones and these ubiquitous devices, we can always be plugged in. So we have the means to get the heroin and continually working. And I think that definition describes a lot of people. In fairness, there are certain stages of life where you're likely going to fall into that category, right? You're likely going to be off balance. In other words, if you're in your 20s and you're buried in student loan debt and you've spent the last 3 or 4 years or 6 years or 8 years or whatever it is getting excited about your career and getting things going, it may make sense to be a little off balance here and be left of center. But most people who are either listening to this podcast or considering their next chapter of their life have probably been doing that kind of grind for the past 20 years. That grind in the end, that off-balanceness that grind has created has left them with a feeling of being unfulfilled and a feeling of not a lot of meaning or purpose in life. And as you age and you start questioning, what the fuck am I doing here? Why am I on this planet? What have I contributed? And you start asking these more esoteric, meaningful, legacy type questions, then you're being called into a new chapter. So thinking about that calling and thinking about that new chapter, you can't navigate that new chapter the same way you navigated the last chapter. And if you just say to yourself, oh, I won't do that, well, you've become habituated. You're a bit of a robot, and it's really hard. The brain just works on pattern recognition. So you're going to have to be intentional. Some of the things are going to be easy for you because you hate it and you hate the fact that you don't have time with your family. So it may be easier for you to spend more time with your family. So I would consider being mindful and intentional about bringing the sides of you into your next chapter that you want to bring. And I think it's like anything else. It's a new muscle that you're going to have to figure out and you're going to have to develop. And this isn't easy for me either, which is why I force myself every year to be around people that are interested in leveling up their life and not just their work. Every time somebody said to me, Rob, you got to level up, man. You got to grow. Every time I heard it, there was a part of me that recoiled, but then there was another part of me that was like, yeah, you're right. One girl once said to me, this like super CEO type gal, she's like, you're not leveling up and neither am I. And I was like, you're right. I'm not leveling up. And so I dig more into work and I started to realize, what does that mean? That's really code word for making more money, isn't it? So I do these events. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I created these events around the world for entrepreneurs to connect with each other in meaningful ways. And if you ever want to come on one of these events, I got another one coming up this summer. We're going to be in the south of France. What they allow me to do is this one in the south of France is going to be 8 couples. It's about half sold out now. We've got 4 really cool couples. It allows me to spend like 4 or 5 days with somebody and having conversations in a really cool place that are creating more meaning. So I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to learn more about that. Okay, so before I go, I want you to think about a couple things. One, think about this vicious work cycle that you may be on and whether or not it resonates with you. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're in good balance and you don't even need to hear this. 2 is get a gut check and see how far on the workaholism scale that you are. And I bet you're probably not that far. And then number 3, make a list of what you don't want to come with you into your next chapter. All right, that's it, everybody. See you next week. The next step in your next chapter, rate and review this podcast. This is one small way to cause a ripple effect and help other people just like you move into their next chapter.